Ask most out-of-towners about Victoria, and you'll hear comments like, a little bit of old England, charming, and more English than the English. Victoria is seen as an outpost of the Empire, as a city whose residents cling to British traditions. This image has been promoted with great success by the tourist industry, but it's an image which excludes important parts of Victoria's past. Throughout this city's history, a surprising mix of cultures contributed to Victoria's growth. Black Americans, Hawaiians, Chinese, French Canadians, and Sikhs are just a few of the groups who immigrated here. But since Victoria began promoting its British image, many of the contributions and confrontations associated with other cultures have been overlooked. Behind the facade of sedate Englishness lies a city shaped by a diverse group of peoples, a city with a lusty and sometimes harsh past. In 1842, Hudson's Bay Company employee James Douglas first saw the rugged wilderness of southern Vancouver Island. His orders were to select a new site for the company's Pacific Coast fur trading headquarters. This new fort would replace Fort Vancouver, which was situated a few hundred miles south in an area soon to become part of the American territories. Douglas's choice was Camelsack, a name given to the area by the indigenous Songhees, who used the land to gather plants for food and medicines. When told of the plans for a fort, the Songhees assumed that trade with the Hudson's Bay Company would be beneficial for the village. James Douglas reported that the news seemed to please them very much.
They immediately offered their services in procuring pickets for the establishment, an offer which I gladly accepted, and promised to pay them a blanket for every 40 pickets of 22 feet by 36 inches which they bring.
With the help of the Songhees, the French-Canadian, Hawaiian, Irish, and Scottish employees of the Hudson's Bay Company constructed the first permanent structure to stand in what is now downtown Victoria. The Songhees, eager for further trade with the fort and hoping for protection from hostile northern natives, moved their village from Cadboro Bay and reconstructed it next to the fort. The following year, a serious confrontation arose between these otherwise amiable neighbors. The trouble first ignited after the disappearance of some of the company's oxen, which were allowed to roam freely outside the palisade. The new commander, Roderick Finlayson, suspected the Songhees and demanded payment. After a number of threats and displays of firepower from both sides, the matter was settled. But then a second confrontation arose when a fire in the Songhees village threatened to spread to the fort. Concerned with the fort's future safety, Finlayson negotiated the relocation of the village. The Songhees cooperated after the Hudson's Bay Company agreed to help ferry their lodges to the new location across the harbor. Here, the Songhees remained until 1911, the equivalent of one lifetime. A life which would have witnessed the fort across the water grow into a city as thousands of immigrants discovered this new land. Britain's move to colonize Vancouver Island began in 1849. The border separating British and American territories had recently been set at the 49th parallel. South of the border, the territories of Washington and Oregon were in the midst of a rapid population growth, and American expansionists began rallying to a call of 5440, or fight. Britain realized it would be difficult to claim a land where it had only a few dozen citizens. To encourage immigration, the colony of Vancouver Island was formed, and the Hudson's Bay Company, as the only formal organization in place, was given the task of parceling out land to settlers. Craig Flour was one of 4 farms started by the Puget Sound Agricultural Company, a subsidiary of the Hudson's Bay Company. To work this land, 4 gentlemen farmers were hired as bailiffs. They arrived from England with family, servants, and 75 farm workers.
They joined a population that was surprisingly cosmopolitan. Most of the enlisted men in the company's military-like organization were Quebecois, Métis, and Hawaiians. Only the Hudson's Bay Company officers were British. As was the custom, almost all of these men had taken native women for wives.
The new arrivals saw themselves as the upper crust of this frontier society. Annie Deans, the wife of one of Craig Flour's servants, clearly thought herself superior to James Douglas, even though he was now governor of the colony.
The governor of Vancouver Island has been in the company out here ever since he was a boy about 15 years, and now is a man upwards of 60 now. So you may say he has been all his life among North American Indians and has got one of them for a wife. So how can it be expected that he can know anything at all about governing one of England's last colonies in North America?
It was not just the bloodline of his wife that was whispered about. Douglas himself had been born out of wedlock, and his mother had been described as a free colored woman. Douglas's Scottish father had lived with her while managing a sugar plantation in British Guiana.
This family history may have influenced Governor Douglas's warm welcome when a group of California blacks inquired about immigration to the colony. In the spring of 1858, an advanced party of 35 blacks booked passage on the side-wheeler Commodore, headed for Victoria.
The arrival of this ship had Victoria's inhabitants staring in disbelief. But their shock wasn't due to the color of anyone on board. Traveling with the blacks were over 400 gold seekers. Victoria's population instantly doubled. But this was just the beginning. News of gold soon reached the world, and the world came to Victoria to buy licenses and get outfitted for the trip to the Fraser.
That first summer, 20,000 gold seekers reached Victoria. There were Americans, Germans, English, French, Italians, Poles, and Chinese. Overnight, Victoria became a tent city. A construction boom followed, and in a 2-month period, 250 wooden structures were built to house the hundreds of businesses that followed the miners.
A San Francisco-based correspondent for the Times of London submitted this description.
I could have written a pretty correct account of the state of Victoria without going out of my office. It is the San Francisco of 1849 reproduced. The same hurry-scurry, hurly-burly, dirt, dust, inconvenience, bad living, bad housing, cheating and lying.
For the first blacks who had arrived on the Commodore, and the few hundred who later followed, the flood of Americans into Victoria created mixed feelings. On one hand, new opportunities opened up which business-minded men like Mifflin Gibbs were quick to grasp. Gibbs and his partner, Peter Lester, opened up one of the first stores to compete with the monopoly long held by the Hudson Bay Company. Other black-owned businesses included the Pioneer Shaving Saloon and Ringo's Hotel and Restaurant, run by Sam Ringo, a former slave.
The downside of this American population boom was the transplanted prejudice the blacks had hoped to escape. The Victoria Gazette of August 24, 1858 ran this letter directed at Reverend Cridge of the Victoria District Church.
The sexton has repeatedly insulted our people by crowding Negro men into the same seats as white and respectable ladies, and otherwise cast the whites and blacks together in such a regular alternation as made the little chapel resemble a chessboard. Why make the Negro your pet subject of affection? Why eulogize the race? Why misrepresent their history?
In 1860, with the blessing of James Douglas, 43 black men formed the Victoria Pioneer Rifle Company, nicknamed the African Rifles. Some of these men were also working as constables for Victoria's police force, but often white American offenders, with the support of bystanders, would refuse to be arrested by the black officers.
By 1865, the gold rush was over, and many of the Americans were returning to the States. This exodus coincided with the end of the American Civil War, which encouraged many of the blacks to join the migration south.
Among those leaving was black businessman Mifflin Gibbs. During his residence here, Gibbs had become one of Victoria's first aldermen, and after returning to the States, would make history by becoming that country's first black judge.
Victoria might have become a forgotten gold rush town, but in 1868 it was selected as the capital after the union of Vancouver Island with the mainland colony of British Columbia. And this new colony was now on the verge of becoming a Canadian province. Canada had agreed to a long list of demands, including the building of a transcontinental railway, which was supposed to begin construction within 2 years. It was assumed Victoria would be the terminus, with a bridge connecting the island to the mainland. After a delay of 8 years, the building of the railway began, but Victoria was no longer rejoicing. The railway line which would connect Canada would not cross to Vancouver Island. Instead, it would terminate on the mainland, encouraging the growth of Gastown, later to be known as Vancouver. With Victorians fearing that trade and industry would be attracted to the mainland, job security became a major concern.
There to receive the anger of the frustrated working class was the growing Chinese community, many of whom had returned to Victoria after the collapse of the goldfields. Employers were taking advantage of the fact that Chinese laborers would work for less pay and under less favorable conditions than their white counterparts.
Ground was broken for the new city hall yesterday morning by the contractor. Amongst the workmen were 2 Chinamen. We would point out to the contractor that the employment of Chinese on city contracts is in contravention of the spirit.
In 1878, the principal issue in the election of a new legislative assembly for British Columbia was the move to have a head tax put on all Chinese entering the country.
In the 1880s, thousands more Chinese men were brought in by labor contractors to meet the temporary demand for workers during the building of the railway. But once the last spike was driven, 15,000 Chinese were put out of work. The Canadian government then gave in to the demands of the working class whites and imposed a head tax of $50 on each Chinese person entering Canada.
Though working men felt threatened by the Chinese, upper and middle class Victorians considered the Chinese a godsend. Almost all the good homes had at least one Chinese servant. And the Chinese laundries and market gardens greatly improved the quality of life.
Up until the turn of the century, Victoria had the largest Chinatown north of San Francisco. For the Chinese, it was more than just a home. It was also a place for entertainment and culture, a business area, and a transition center where new arrivals were trained to survive in Canadian society.
There were always language difficulties. One Chinese restaurateur, after going bankrupt, gave his list of debtors as lean man, white man, French old man, get tight man, Indian Joe, fat Frenchman, and lame leg man. Outsiders portrayed Chinatown as a dangerous and mysterious slum of subterranean passages and hidden doorways, leading to brothels, opium shacks, and gambling dens.
As men sought distraction from lonely lives without family, gambling became a popular pastime. However, unlike the white gambling halls across town, it was the traditional game of fan tan which grew in popularity in Chinatown. The ability of fan-tan players to elude the police during frequent raids led to rumors in the white community of tunnels beneath Chinatown. These rumors still circulate today, but it was actually a labyrinth of passages and courtyards behind and between buildings, which allowed the escaping patrons to emerge innocently onto the street.
It is ironic by today's standards that though police continually raided the fan-tan clubs, the issuing of city licenses legitimized Chinatown's opium factories. This drug was outlawed in the States, but remained legal in Canada up until 1908.
The Tai Yuen factory near City Hall was just one of 14 opium establishments listed in the 1889 city directory.
Victorians became familiar with an odor much like boiling potatoes, which drifted from Chinatown when the drug was being manufactured.
Much of the opium manufactured in these factories were smuggled to San Francisco and Portland, and after the opening of the Canadian Pacific Railway, traveled through border crossings across the nation.
The anticipated economic slump from the loss of the railway terminus did not immediately happen. For the remainder of the 1800s, Victoria's population grew steadily. One by one, the tired wooden gold rush buildings were disappearing, and in their place, stout brick business blocks were creating a mood of permanence and stability. Manufacturing industries boomed, with an ironworks, 5 boot and shoe factories, 4 wagon and carriage factories, half a dozen cigar factories, 2 bookbinderies, a vinegar works, and a corset factory. As the end of the century drew closer, Victoria was also well on its way to becoming a city of beautiful houses and gardens. Victorians could take pride in the fact that their city was still the largest and wealthiest in the province. In 1897, the discovery of gold in the Klondike fueled more optimism. Victoria got the jump on Vancouver and became the main port of entry. Gold seekers stood in line at the customs house to receive their licenses, and then moved off to the gold fields. The Klondike years also saw BC's original government offices, nicknamed the bird cages, replaced with an impressive and more permanent structure. In 1897, thousands of lights were switched on, outlining it against the sky as a tribute to Queen Victoria on her Diamond Jubilee. The Queen was also receiving a tribute from another of her frontiers. Sikh lancers and infantrymen, respected across the empire, had made the trip to England to take part in the celebrations.
As these soldiers made the long journey home, they traveled across Canada to the Pacific. In British Columbia, they realized the potential of this land. The Sikhs took their impressions back to India, and immigration began a few years later.
Because these immigrants were all British subjects, they were guaranteed free movement throughout the empire. By 1911, Victoria was publishing Canada's first Sikh newspaper, and the next year saw the construction of the city's first Sikh temple. Victoria's Mayor Beckwith greeted the news of the temple's opening with this statement:
"The Asiatics have come into British Columbia in such numbers that there are Hindu temples in Victoria and Vancouver. The Hindus are a source of trouble. They are not suited to the country, they are immoral and quarrelsome, and have not stamina enough to become good workers."
The privileges of being a British subject were short-lived. In an attempt to stop the Sikhs from entering the country, the Canadian government created a loophole which stated that immigrants from India must travel directly from India, stopping at no foreign ports along the way.
No steamship lines offered this option, and so immigration ended. anyone who attempted the journey was turned back.
From the turn of the century, Victoria's population had been falling behind that of Vancouver. Its industrial base was slipping away to the mainland. Victoria would have to explore new economic solutions if it was to survive. Victoria's harbor provided the answer. When the CPR began running a new line of steamers into Victoria, tourism quickly became a major industry. The city eagerly donated the mudflat, which separated the legislative precinct from the business district. And the CPR built a centerpiece for the harbor. In 1908, the Empress Hotel opened to welcome the growing number of Victoria-bound travelers.
As in the days of old, the sea is the highway to Victoria. Her gateway is her picturesque harbor. Today, one steps ashore from palatial coastal liners to be greeted by an atmosphere which is distinctly restful, as exemplified by the ivy-covered Empress Hotel, a modern hostelry of world
The CPR's Princess line of steamers provided regular fast service to the mainland and minimized the problem of the city's island location. The company's Empress fleet linked Victoria with ports across the Pacific. British civil servants from India, Singapore, Borneo, and Hong Kong were introduced to the city. Relaxed by the comfort of the Empress Hotel and impressed with the mild climate and beautiful gardens, many decided to invest and retire in Victoria. Architects, following the lead of Samuel McClure, found a market for homes which were of a progressive North American style, but with touches of Tudor, creating an impression of Englishness. Though many of McClure's clients were born in Victoria, they thought of themselves as British subjects first and Canadians second. Their hearts and loyalties belonged to England.
Victorians greeted the outbreak of war with a burst of heartfelt patriotism. The city's grand homes became the setting for garden parties to raise money. The streets were crowded with uniforms and came alive with military bands and parades. When news of the Lusitania's sinking reached the city, anti-German sentiment heated Victoria to a boiling point. Rumors quickly spread that Victoria's German population had celebrated the sinking. It was a wild night. Hundreds of rioters moved through the town, ransacking the businesses of anyone who was German or had a German-sounding name. After the war, soldiers returning to Victoria faced stiff competition for a dwindling number of jobs. With Vancouver now firmly established as the province's industrial center, large numbers of the working population began to abandon Victoria.
Nothing at all interesting happened in Victoria after the war. Help was impossible to get. Prices went sky high. Everything changed, you know.
Dullish as an English town would be on a Sunday. Everything shut up, church atmosphere and so on.
Businessmen realized that if they wanted more for their city than years of slow, genteel decay, they would have to aggressively promote its assets. Enter the Publicity Bureau and its commissioner, George Warren. Warren and the Bureau were determined to make the city attractive to American tourists. The promotion of Victoria as a little bit of old England encouraged the presentation of the city as a stage set. To help portray this image, the city's oldest brick building was one of many disguised with a veneer of pseudo-Tudor half-timbering. Emphasizing Victoria's Englishness has had many benefits. Countless tourists have been charmed by the city's interpretation of jolly old England. But for anyone who looks behind this facade, there is a richer history to be appreciated. Humboldt Street was the location of Kanaka Row, where Victoria's Hawaiian population settled. Still standing and completely restored is the Temple Emmanuel, built during the first gold rush, and now Canada's oldest standing synagogue. This French-style convent was constructed to house the Sisters of St. Anne. These nuns first arrived from Quebec in 1858 and contributed to the education of British Columbians for over a century. An awareness of Victoria's culturally diverse past creates a picture very different than the one most visitors see. This was a city of opium dens and temples, of forts and castles, of parades and potlatches. Victoria's British roots are genuine, but to call her more English than the English is to see only the facade.
As a place in which to live, it is different from other cities, less in a hurry, more tranquil, more beautiful. It is no wonder that Cook, Vancouver, and a host of adventurers of other years recognized in Victoria a journey's end, a goal to compensate for the hardships of those bygone days. Today, Victoria is a city of sunshine, of flowers and gardens, of trim boulevards and lovely streets. Everywhere are the greenest of green lawns and hedges rivaling those of old England. Zero weather is unknown, so also is excessive heat. The temperature varies little from summer to winter, and there is always sunshine. After office hours, the tired businessman goes home and grows young amidst his flowers. And here is still another reminder of old England.